Heal yourself.
I need more mana. One down.
Gaining strength.
One down.
Beware the scorpion sting.
No mana.
You surprise me, Taljari, but you have yet to cast off the shackles of fate.
Out of mana.
There can be no... Who are you to overthrow your fate?
That was easy.
Do you want your ranger to minimize gearing up as you blitz through the campaign? Want a strong starter for endgame mapping to build up your capital with? Want to then push through your third and fourth ascendancies, one-shot every boss fight, blast juice to the gills tier 15 maps, and crack almost 300 million experience per hour, all with a setup that requires no overpriced uniques, excessive currency farming, or insane luck to play? Sounds like my Ball Lightning Arrow Ranger build is the one for you. In this guide, I'll be covering the skill gems, support gems, passive tree, and finally the gearing up of this build that's not only survived the cast on ailment nerfs, it's thrived because of them. Through the whole process, I'm also going to be not just telling you what this build takes to run, but explaining how it runs, why it works the way it does, and how to play it optimally during mapping and boss fights. I've left some helpful chapters in the description down below so you can easily navigate through this video to the section relevant to your questions or curiosities. And if you're sticking with me from the beginning, have your cup of coffee at the ready and strap in because this is going to be a long video. First skill we'll talk about is the core of the build that sees us all the way from the very first few moments of the game to the end. That is Lightning Arrow. Now, normally one skill really dominates the show when it comes to builds in Path of Exile 2, but this build is very combo-centric. So although this skill is a large portion of our DPS, it's far from the majority. That being said, we're going to be using a full set of support gems that boost its damage dealing potential. First of which being Martial Tempo for a 25% increase to attack speed to help with the abysmal early game attack speeds you'll be feeling while providing a sizable DPS increase itself. Lightning Infusion, which is very close to a 25% overall damage increase due to how little we deal of the other elements. Primal Armament for a pretty straightforward 25% more damage. And lastly, Rising Tempest, which becomes a very sizable DPS increase despite its wording, just because you've likely got a mix of different elemental damage flats mixed into your gear, proccing the support gem. I don't have a fifth support here, and it's really not necessary to have. Something that's rather nice about this build is perfect jeweler orbs are extremely expensive, and this build really doesn't need any fifth support gems on its skills to be functional or at full power. They're just nice to have. The next skill is Lightning Rod, which unlocks our main combo for dealing damage. This skill can deploy up to 20 rods to the field at a time, and each one can be activated up to 15 times each at my current skill level, although it will scale higher with higher levels, for an additional splash of AoE lightning damage each time, creating our bread and butter combo of spreading as many lightning rods out onto the enemy as possible, then proccing the rods for massive bursts of damage with our lightning arrow. This, for the entirety of the campaign, is your main source of damage on bosses, and even in the endgame remains your main way of dealing with mobs during mapping. To highlight the strengths of the skill, we've socketed Scatter Shot, which, although gives us a hefty penalty to the skill's damage and attack speed, through those additional projectiles allows us to deploy the maximum number of lightning rods far more quickly for optimal DPS than we'd be able to otherwise, not only serving as a massive quality of life improvement, but an overall DPS increase as well. Next, we add in Magnified Effect. Even at max quality, the maximum AoE of the Rod Burst is only going to be about 2.4 meters. So we really want to maximize that for not only better AoE clearing capability, but better overlap when centering the rods around bosses. Something especially noticeable when fighting bosses with smaller hitboxes. Next, we add in Conduction, as this is a 100% multiplicative increase to this skill's chance to shock. And with this skill proccing up to 20 hits per activation against bosses, this skill is our main way of generating charges for our Cast on Shock skill gem we'll be talking about shortly. With conduction, we reach ridiculous levels of shock chance that basically guarantees each of the lightning rods is proccing shock on the target for additional damage received and cast on shock charges. Next, because we're basically going to be enjoying permanent shock status thanks to conduction, we take overcharge, increasing the magnitude of our shocks by a sizable 75% at the expense of shock duration, which we've basically removed as a factor with our previous gem choice. Shock functions as an additional multiplier for our damage, so we want to be taking advantage of it and scaling it up when we get the chance. And with this gem, all on its own, scaling that shock magnitude from a 20% overall damage increase to 35%, it's not only a significant improvement for the damage our rods are dealing, but the damage our entire kit is dealing as well. Lastly, if you do decide to throw a perfect jeweler orb into this build, it's a tough call on where to throw it, but I've put it into the lightning rods and added heft for a further increase in damage potential. Next is Cast on Shock, the meta skill that enables the skill that our build is named after. Although Cast on Ailment skills have been nerfed to being about 5% as effective against normal trash mobs, Cast on Shock is not limited to gaining charge only once per cast of a skill, meaning all of the lightning rods we're stacking onto rares and bosses, which have not had their charge gain reduced, are filling this gem's charge at such a rapid pace that this skill causes infinite loops of the ball lightning we've socketed into it. This is because the balls of lightning reaching our patches of lightning rods constantly proc them, firing off massive chunks of damage into the target and causing an uncalculatable number of shocks, spamming the refill on the cast on shock gem, creating infinite balls of lightning until your mana runs dry. Now, this is extremely expensive on our mana supply, running us nearly instantly out of mana if we go full gas. This is especially true when we take things too far by adding on impetus for 40% more energy gain, and energy retention for a 35% chance for 50% of the energy to be refunded on activation. Now, there's pretty much only one way we can make our mana last infinitely in the form of a ring that we'll talk about in the gearing section. But that's okay because we don't actually need our mana to last forever. We just needed to hold out through our flask until the boss is dead. And as you've seen, we accomplished this relatively easily with this setup. This all being said, we still want this loop to sustain as long as possible, so we're going to add on Inspiration to reduce the skill cost by 40%. We can also reduce the DPS of the loop by increasing the longevity of our mana by swapping out Energy Retention for Deceleration, as slowing down the projectile will cause it to travel more slowly through our lightning rods, proccing them more times per cast. Remember, the ball lightning is doing very little damage on its own. It's just a battery to keep proccing our lightning rods, so we don't want to invest any damage support here. In total, you need 95 intelligence to run this setup, and again, because the damage doesn't matter, you'll want to run the ball lightning at the lowest level possible. Next up is a bossing skill, Orb of Storms. Many bosses in Path of Exile 2 will allow you to set up skills below them before becoming active. And Orb of Storms takes full advantage of that, serving as yet another lightning rod activator. Laying the orb below the boss at the beginning and during the fight procs the lightning rods repeatedly throughout its lifespan for even more DPS than the ball lightning can proc, basically creating a situation where we no longer even have time to cast Lightning Arrow during boss fights, as we have to constantly be reapplying the lightning rods below the boss. We take this several steps too far by socketing Chain to chain the Orb of Storms an additional time, Persistence for 40% more duration, and Unleash, causing the Orb of Storms to reoccur for even more procs per cast at the cost of the damage we, again, just don't care about because this is just an enabler for our lightning rods. For a fourth support, we'd run Overabundance, giving us the ability to set yet another Orb of Storms down at the cost of some duration for even more burst damage. Although, even without this gem, the orbs and ball lightning basically instantly eat our lightning rod stacks, so don't feel too stressed about getting a greater jeweler's orb for the skill or trying to Valor a fourth slot. This is going to bring us to our supporting cast of additional skills, starting with Herald of Thunder. This doesn't really do much of anything during a single target boss fight on its own, causing additional lightning bolts to strike enemies anytime a shocked enemy dies. And because every enemy during our map clear is shocked, this cascades a lightning bolt down to every enemy in the pack until they all die from the chain reaction. We socket Innervate for 35% more damage following the death of any shocked enemies, basically adding 35% damage constantly and during the chain reactions where packs of mobs die during maps. Concentrated effect, due to the skill already having a very small area of effect, so lowering it from 1.6 meters to zero point 0.8 meters has very little repercussions compared to the extra 40% damage it deals as a result of taking this. And finally, Clarity, basically giving us an always active additive bonus to our mana regeneration rate, something we are constantly fighting with. Next, we have Voltaic Mark as our one mark skill. This causes the mark target to have a 33% greater magnitude on its shock status, increasing our DPS against single targets like rares and bosses significantly, but also makes them 50% more susceptible to being shocked, functioning as yet another way of us maximizing the likelihood of every instance of damage shocking the bosses and rares to create our infinite loops. In addition to all of that, the target causes an AoE explosion of damage on death, making it a decent add on for spicier packs of mobs during map pulls when needed. There aren't really any super relevant supports we can attach to this skill, so I've currently just got mine holding a 25% increase in cast speed, making it a bit snappier to apply during combat. There are lots of skill gems we'd like to have here, like persistence, but they are just more necessary elsewhere, and the support gems don't matter much when it comes to our mark. Next up is Magnetic Salvo, which is a skill that falls off around mid tier mapping, but really helps out around the end of Cruel difficulty and beginner level mapping. Magnetic Salvo fires a huge burst of arrows at each of our lightning rods for cataclysmic amounts of damage, but then removes the lightning rod's hit in the process, making this a nice chunky nuke to hold in your back pocket, but something you'll be using less and less as your lightning arrow and lightning rod get to the point where they're butchering magic mobs as fast as normal ones. To capitalize on its bursty nature, though, we socket Hourglass, adding a 10-second cooldown for 40% more damage, and Inevitable Critical for 100% more critical hit chance when we do decide to use this skill. As because we are very infrequently using this ability, the downsides of both of these supports basically don't apply to us. In its last slot, I've taken Elemental Focus for 25% further damage. We don't much care if Magnetic Salvo causes a shock, as it's deleting all of our lightning rods anyway, meaning any ball lightning thrown by it would be wasted. And the packs of mobs we're using the skill on are already shocked and then dead following the skill activation, making the shocks it would have applied useless. Finally, we take Electrocuting Arrow. The skill really helps out in the mid game, especially where it serves as a way to hard crowd control the bosses so that you get a chance to fire off some good uptime with your lightning rods, and stays relevant as our main form of boss CC in the end game. After a clunky flipping animation to fire the arrows, the target is susceptible to electrocution buildup from any source of lightning damage, something we have in excess, often leading the boss to be instantly hard crowd controlled for 5 full seconds while we lay into it with our full kit. The only time a boss survives this at endgame is when we've neglected to use our mana flask or reapply the lightning rods as they extinguish. Although electrocution is strong, they did nerf its buildup quite a bit in the latest patch, which has made it pretty difficult to apply onto the tougher bosses in the endgame, although it is still possible. I've put close combat on this skill only because it does deal a bit of damage on its own, and it's rare we want to be standing nuts to butts with the boss otherwise, so there isn't really another favorable option for the support gem unless you're willing to throw this on your rods or lightning arrow and play it point blank. More importantly, though, I've socketed Unbreakable as this is a really annoying skill to have canceled mid animation, not to mention a very jarring one, so making it fire more reliably really cuts down on the jank you experience while using it. Lastly, Neural Overload, just because there are times where you can use the skill, especially if you are still at the progression points where it's relevant to use it on rares, where firing this arrow in the middle of a field of lightning rods will instantly proc the electrocution thanks to this gem. But really, beyond the Unbreakable gem, it doesn't much matter what you run on this skill. During leveling, and again, should you get a necklace with the spirit for it at the end game, I also recommend running Wind Dancer as an additional aura. Wind Dancer provides a pretty sizable increase to your evasion, which is our main way of staying alive, especially during map clearing, and also knocks back would be melee attackers, keeping us safe when we could otherwise have been swarmed. For the support gems, we take Wind Wave, giving us another layer of defense should shit hit the fan hard enough we're being stunned in melee range, providing another knockback for those melee attackers. Overpower, giving the skill a bit more stun buildup and crowd control value. And Blind, ensuring it's more difficult to land repeated hits on us by the melee attackers we've just knocked back. Wind Dancer is soundly in the nice to have additional safety category, so don't stress too much about keeping this online once you give it up for Cast on Shock upon getting the requirements for it. I sure haven't, as you can see. Although, if you're fighting a spicy single target boss, you can't always turn off Herald of Thunder in favor of the survivability buff, especially if it's a very projectile heavy encounter. All right, that was a hell of a lot to take in as far as the skill gems. If you're still early in the game and trying to follow along with the skill section of this video and are feeling a bit overwhelmed or confused, I do have an early game version of this guide on my channel, which I'll be leaving a link to below, that walks you through the campaign skilling of these gems more thoroughly, rather than focusing on endgame setup. Welcome to those using the chapters, though, as we're moving on to the passive tree section, first talking about our ascendancies. We've chosen Deadeye for this build as it's just strictly better for our needs than Pathfinder. For your first ascendancy, I recommend taking Gathering Winds as the Tailwind passive when fully stacked, 30% skill speed, 150% additive evasion, and 10% movement speed feels amazing as a first ascendancy, especially when we are rather low on additive evasion, skill speed, and movement speed improvements otherwise. Granted, we lose this buff when hit by anything, but because we're a full evasion build for our defenses, we are not often actually hit by anything other than slams and AoEs, giving us a very good uptime on the buff. This makes it a bit painful to say I decided to actually respec out of this buff following my second ascendancy in favor of taking point blank and endless munitions. The extra projectile applies to all of our skills, including ball lightning, doubling up on our procs provided by Cast on Shock, as well as adding another projectile to our lightning rod, making it that much easier to maintain 20 rods on the field at a time, with point blank functioning as a multiplicative 20% increase to our lightning rods and 20% increase to all of our damage while standing within 3.5 meters of the target. I feel these two passives outweigh the benefit of Tailwind once they become available following the second ascendancy. But the very moment you get your third ascendancy, obviously get Tailwind back because it's just such a great buff. Then, after your fourth ascendancy, take Wind Ward, giving us a 30% damage reduction to that hit which took us out of Tailwind, drastically reducing the lethality of those physical damage slams and chaos damage AoEs. Though even after taking this passive serves as our leading cause of death. And given the rarity we're hit with Tailwind up, this 30% damage reduction comes in clutch more often than not, protecting us from lots of nasty stuff in the endgame once we've got it online that would have otherwise taken us down in one hit. Getting into the passive tree itself, though, we first path through some projectile damage nodes to honed instincts for a bunch of desirable stats, then through vile wounds, as our enemies are basically always afflicted with elemental ailments following our first hit, and we don't really benefit from the 15% piercing chance provided by Clean Shot due to picking up piercing later on down the line, making these three nodes still decent but less desirable compared to the ailment chance and damage increase from vile wounds. For attribute nodes, we'll be taking intelligence as necessary to get the 95 we require for our build to work, strength as needed to keep the lights on with our strength support gems, and otherwise dumping all of our stat nodes into dexterity past those requirements. First, we go down to the node cluster, including Spreading Shocks and Thunderstruck. Spreading Shocks really helps crank out our proc rate for shocks on our lightning rods, especially early in the game. And Thunderstruck is important for making our electrocuting arrow and electrocution build up functional against powerful bosses. So this one is pretty essential all game long for helping to enable our boss crowd control capability. If you don't care for that factor of the build, though, you could possibly drop this one at endgame. Next, we pass through Catapult and the attack area nodes leading up to it. The 31% increase in area of effect is extremely helpful, again, especially early for pumping up the surface area of our lightning rods, letting us get more procs on smaller bosses, and improving our ability to clear screens of mobs during mapping. Not to mention the projectile speed increase becomes a damage increase for us later on in our passive tree. We're now going to shift back to our starting point and grab up some nodes for additional evasion and survivability that we neglected on our way through, taking cat-like agility and blur for a chunk of evasion, extra movement speed, and a bit of dex. Following this, if you've got your hands on a strong quiver, especially one with additional projectile skill levels, we take the nodes for master fletching, as well as all of the nodes for quiver effect. This is a pretty massive DPS increase depending on how good of a quiver you have, so feel free to leave this line of nodes till later if you're struggling with mana costs after taking it due to the skill levels, or you just need time to get a better quiver to make it worthwhile. But be sure to grab these at some point. Next, loop up to Surging Currents for some lightning penetration. In total, this build ends up with 96% penetration just from the passive tree. So if you were wondering why lightning exposure made no appearance in our support gem slots, this is why. Next, path through freedom of movement and our first jewel socket, as well as catalysis. This stacks us with some additional evasion, and catalysis not only provides us with a bit of extra damage, but converts 5% of the physical damage we take into elemental damage. Considering we have zero armor and basically take pure damage from physical hits, that 5% conversion helps take the edge off those spicier physical slam attacks that you've probably died to more than a couple times by now. From there, we path to Maiming Strike for some additional raw damage, as well as a bit of movement speed. But beyond that, we're also getting some extra maim chance on all of our hits. With how many hits we dish out, basically all our opponents are permanently, instantly maimed from this node, meaning we also get to skip attaching it to, say, our Lightning Rod as a support gem with this passive node. Until you get to this node, though, it might not be a bad idea to have Maim on your lightning rods if you need a bit of slowdown before now. After that, push through the nearby jewel socket all the way to Feathered Fletching and Pierce the Heart. Up until now, it wasn't a bad idea to have Pierce as one of your lightning arrow support gems, but if you have done that until now for extra AoE, you can now say goodbye to that and exchange it for a damage increase. Feathered Fletching is also going to translate to an absolutely incredible DPS increase. As it turns out, our projectiles fly quite fast. So this is a lot of damage added on. Next, we grab Acceleration for some bonus movement speed and 10% skill speed. At this point, your skill speed should be feeling pretty great or bordering on unnecessarily high. This next jump is a bit expensive, but we path down to the jewel socket, then up to this node cluster, including Force of Nature and Emboldened Avatar for some additional penetration and a chunk of extra shock, plus electrocute buildup. Right next door, we then pick up yet another 30% shock chance and 15% more penetration. This next part, feel free to do earlier if you feel like you need to pump up your evasion. Path through escape velocity for some more movement speed and evasion, pick up the jewel socket, then all the way to the bestial skin node if you've managed to secure a chest piece with over 1k evasion before taking this node, as it provides an incredible increase if you have. While you're here, grab Enhanced Evasion. On our way out, we take Falcon Technique for a scaling amount of attack speed based on our dexterity. And as we are grabbing this quite late in the game, turns out you should have quite a good chunk of dexterity to make this node worthwhile. After this, we path upward to Storm Surge for some lightning penetration and Unbound Forces for a chunk of extra shock magnitude and shock duration, which starts to scale up our shock damage multiplier even further. Coming in at pretty good timing as we've now established some very large modifiers in our other buckets. Next, grab the jewel slot going up and path all the way to General Electric for a huge boost to shock chance and 5% action speed. Then to Harmonic Generator for a 25% critical hit chance increase against shocked enemies, as well as a massive 40% increase to our shock magnitude when the shock is applied through a critical hit. Turns out, even though we're not very invested in critical hits, we cause so many hits and have such a high shock rating that this extra magnitude is basically always active against bosses. Now, we're in the very last of our points here, so I recommend grabbing Coming Calamity, making Herald of Thunder a much better investment during boss fights by providing a very strong 50% extra damage node. As a final note, I also want to talk a bit about acrobatics. Now, acrobatics sounds really appealing, but the only attacks you can't dodge with evasion are AoE attacks, almost all of which are well telegraphed. So, giving up a huge chunk of your dodge chance against much quicker, less telegraphed attacks in exchange for something you could otherwise just focus on dodging specifically doesn't really make sense to me personally. But you can experiment with it if you want to. There's still some experimentation to be done with the passive tree in general, as I'm not quite at level 100 myself yet or anything, but if I make any changes in the future to this tree, it'll be reflected in the Mobalytics page in the description below. That will finally bring us to the endgame gearing section. Welcome to our chapter, enjoyers, and let's get started with the bow. For your bow, we want a bow that fires an additional arrow. That extra arrow brings our lightning rods up to 5 rods per shot, allowing us to very easily max out our potential in just 4 casts instead of what would otherwise have been 5. And the extra coverage of the third lightning arrow projectile just makes clearing a lot more comfortable. This modifier is also written onto dual string bows, although it can be obtained on others as well. Most importantly, though, we are looking for as much flat damage in our prefixes as physically possible, as this is pretty much where all our damage is derived from. All the multipliers we've stacked up for our damage don't mean anything if they aren't buffing up a high base value. So a combination of percent increased physical damage and added flat physical lightning damage, or both, are essential to the makings of a good bow. Beyond these two qualifications, any strong extras like attack speed and critical stats make for some good icing. Additional projectile levels are also extremely good damage increasers here, but every projectile skill level means more mana cost, so you really have to be careful how hard you're scaling your skill levels with this build. Particularly powerful bows can get a little expensive, so don't be afraid to collect expert dual string bows you see during your maps and craft on them. For your rings, we again want as much flat physical and lightning damage as we can find, as well as maximum life. If you need to cap out your resistances still, then rolling some resistance lines on these will also be extremely helpful. And finally, we want mana regeneration rate, if at all possible, as well, given we are constantly fighting to stay above our mana requirements. For the amulet, plus 2 extra projectile levels is the starting point for any decent amulet for us. From there, maximum life, critical chance, resistances if needed, and some spirit if you want to keep Wind Dancer active at all times, which are all really good options. You can't really go wrong with any of this. When anointing your amulet, though, I recommend putting high alert on any amulet you wouldn't call your last one, and putting Essence of the Storm on your final best in slot piece for an overall 5% increase in damage. For your quiver, plus 2 projectile levels and as much flat physical and lightning damage as possible is our baseline. As keep in mind, all of our quiver stats are being improved by our passive tree by 80%. Other decent options, if you already have these three, are increased bow damage, critical stats, attack speed, or projectile speed, as remember, that gives us damage thanks to the passive tree. Personally, I prefer to roll on visceral quivers, which have critical hit chance. For your chest piece, above all else, we want more than 1000 evasion, and realistically, even more than that. So, a flat evasion roll as well as percent increased evasion roll are necessary baselines. Beyond that, additional max life and resistances are great additions. For the runes, use iron runes to further increase the evasion rating on this chest piece, as again, all of our evasion on this chest is being counted twice thanks to our bestial skin passive. On our gloves, we want as much flat damage as we can get once again, so flat physical and lightning rolls are great. Next, we want to max life and any resistances we need to work on maxing. For the rune, you'll suck at whatever resistance you need to shore up by 12%. For boots, movement speed is king and priority above all else, followed by maximum life and resistances once again. The faster we move, the faster we clear, the faster we scale our character. Lastly, for the helmet and belt, you'll be looking for maximum life and mana rolls, as well as any resistances you still need to cap your elemental resistances at 75%. As a final note on gearing, and it's absolutely not necessary that you get this ring to be successful and fight the pinnacle bosses, but the Thief's Torment Emerald Ring unique really breaks the game, providing you with an answer to your mana problems, completing the infinite loop in earnest. Problem is, you'll need to fix your resistances without your ring slots, and this ring costs 5 divs at the time of recording minimum. So, this ring is the goal of goals for this build if you've already stacked to the gills without it, looking to take things to another level and become a godlike figure without effortlessly you burn down even the strongest bosses in the game. All right, that will sum up my entire guide on my endgame Ball Lightning Ranger. Hopefully, this guide helped you out or offered you some insight into how to possibly tweak your own builds. I'm looking to branch out into making guides for Path of Exile 2 full time, in addition to my other YouTube content. So, if you did find this video useful, I'd appreciate it if you left it a like and shared it around, as it really helps me towards that goal. If you'd like to take a look at my written guide to this video, I've also left a link to the Mobalytics page with it down below in the description. Thank you to my coffee supporters who help keep the channel going, and thank you for watching till the end. I'll see you next time.